Hey everybody, good afternoon and welcome to our first virtual plant clinic of 2023. Time flies. I cannot believe we are already in 2023. Just wanted to give a few minutes for people to get started logging in. I'm putting us on Facebook Live now. So while we're waiting for everybody to get logged in, I've got a few notes for you guys and some announcements before I hand things over to David. First of all, you all are here, so I'm assuming you have seen that our event schedule has been going up for winter and spring. We are continuing to add events to that schedule, honestly, pretty much on a daily basis still. So if you check back every few days, you'll see we're still adding classes, especially in the end of March, April, May. So that will continue to be updated. We'll send out emails about those classes as well. And the most important, most exciting fact is that we are really resuming our in-person classes this season. So have a look on the website. You will see the location. Most of you probably know, but not necessarily. We have 3 locations. So when you see a class that is in person, check which store it's at, Fair Oaks, Gainesville, or the Merrifield Gallows Road location, just so that you show up at the right place. But we will have in-person classes as well as Zoom this season, which is very, very exciting. Alrighty. For this webinar, I'm going to hand it over to David in just a moment. But if you have any questions, if you're on our Zoom, type those questions into the Q&A box and I'll be monitoring those. If you are on Facebook, feel free to comment. I'll be monitoring that as well. Just a little warning, sometimes there's a lag and I don't always see the questions on Facebook until a minute or two later. So just have a little patience and I'll try and get to those as well. But I think that about covers it. David, I know you have a good number of houseplants sitting with you today, so I'm looking forward to hearing about that. And I'm going to go ahead and let you get started.
Excellent. Well, Happy New Year, everybody. Appreciate you taking this afternoon to come join Sally and I. I hope everybody had a wonderful holiday season. You know, haven't really seen any of you, at least not on our plant clinics here since I guess it was around Christmas of last year. So it's great to be back. And I can say Happy New Year because it is both still January. So I feel like I can say that. Also, this Sunday happens to be the Chinese New Year. So I put together a little display here in recognition of that. I don't pretend to know that much about it, but I do know that a lot of these plants have very symbolic meanings in that celebration, and it is the year of the rabbit. So again, Happy New Year to everybody. Hope you're finding everybody happy and healthy, and thanks again for being back here today. So as Sally mentioned, I always like to keep this very conversational. I welcome and encourage lots of questions throughout the time. So I'm going to start out talking a little bit about potting soil, potting mix. I get lots of questions about that. And it's something I've really been focusing a lot of attention on for the last couple of years, and I get a lot of questions about. So I know you came to hear about plants, but I'm actually going to take a first part of this program and talk really about the potting soil or potting mix that we use to grow them in. And after that, then we'll talk about plants, and we can talk about anything at all that you like. So we'll have plenty of opportunity to bring those questions in. But let's get started here. So I like to start out just with a couple definitions because a lot of people are in here shopping, and one of the things that we run into is when we're talking about, I'm just getting my screen to where it looks good. Okay. Coming in looking for, potting soil or potting mix, different things out there, and talk a little bit about exactly what we're doing, using, and some of the language that goes in there. So this is a definition that I like, what is soil? Found this came off of Wikipedia, but there's a lot of different variations on it. But here we're talking about, you can see this, but I'm reading through it anyway. Soil, also commonly referred to as earth or dirt, is a mixture of organic matter. So organic matter, this is the compost. You know, this can be whatever organic material, you know, leaves, twigs, sticks, hate to say it, you know, insects, animals, you know, all the living stuff that falls to the ground, decomposes and becomes incorporated into the ground, becomes that organic component. The minerals, and this I think is a real key point that I'll be focusing our attention on. So over the eons of time, right, basically rock weathers, you know, over again, millions, billions of years, the rock breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces, and eventually ends up where it's classified as either sand, silt, or clay, depending on the size of those particles. But essentially it's weathered rock that provide the minerals into the soil. Also, this is an inclusive term that's going to include not just the solid material, but also within that pore space between the particles, which includes, you know, the gases. You know, the roots must have oxygen, and they're also respiring and putting carbon dioxide back out. The liquids, which can be things like water, we hope, in the soil, and the living component, the microorganisms, the bacteria, the fungi, the nematodes, the, you know, worms, and so on, the animals that live in the ground. So all of this together inclusively becomes what we refer to as soil. And the real key definition here is that that soil will support life. So I think most of us in the gardening community would say dirt really is just, dirt doesn't exactly support life. So we tend to prefer using the word soil because that's something our plants will grow in. So Dad instructs say, hey, dirt, that's stuff that gets under your nails, you know, or that you have to sweep up off the floor. Soil is the good stuff that actually supports life in the ground. So where I'm going kind of with this conversation is when we begin taking soil and putting it into pots and containers for the purpose of growing plants, that becomes oftentimes referred to as potting soil. But as we do that, and we put it in there, when you're growing plants in containers, we're looking for different properties that are in there. So for example, a real key component that we talk about when we're growing in containers is making sure that we have adequate drainage so that the water can actually flow through this and it doesn't become waterlogged, and where our plants, the roots don't just literally suffocate and drown in there. We also have to be concerned about, again, the living component that's in there, because when we put stuff into pots and containers, that means we get all the ants and millipedes and, you know, gnats and everything else that goes with it. So when we take that soil and put it into pots, we go through a special process. And I'm old enough to remember back in the day when my freshman year of college, back at that time, my professor actually liked to incorporate soil into our greenhouse mixes. But we don't necessarily want to bring all the ants and pill bugs and bacteria and fungi and all the pathogens that are in there. So that soil would literally be dug, harvested from the field, you know, agricultural lands. We would put it into these huge bins, and then it was pasteurized. It literally was steam treated. We'd have to put soil into this these pasteurized process where it cooks for several days, bring it up and maintain the temperature to kind of bring it to a point where it's not sterilized, because we don't want to kill off the beneficial bacteria and fungi, but we bring it hot enough to kill off all the pathogens, weed seeds, and all that other stuff, and then bring it in, mix it with other amendments to bring it to the right physical properties, and then that's what would go in as potting soil. So potting soil, just to make a differentiation here, we can use this word somewhat interchangeably: potting soil, growing media, potting mix, potting compost. These are basically used interchangeably, that goes into that. As you can see, this was first used back in the 1800s, but again, it was specific for use in pots. what's happened is because when you're actually putting soil in there, this mixture of the clay minerals, the organic matter and all that, because of all the labor I was talking about in terms of having to take it, pasteurize it, mix it, nowadays, very, very, very few companies actually put soil in their potting soil. So there's a lot of confusion out there. Myself being kind of a purist in how these words have different meanings, I resent calling something potting soil if there is no actual soil in there. So I use the word potting mix, and frequently customers will come in, they're looking for potting soil. The label says potting mix or potting media. That's where all this sort of comes from. So again, if you're looking for potting soil, what actually has real soil in it, that's a hard to find thing nowadays. It's good. Again, my old professor always loved putting some soil in there because it's water holding and mineral holding capacity and has some good properties, but just logistically, economically and stuff, very, very few people are doing that unless you decide to mix it on your own. So this goes on because that was the process that we used for many, many decades. Literally taking soil, pasteurizing it, with heat and then processing it into use for greenhouse production and stuff. But along about the mid-60s, because of all the issues we were just talking about, a couple of specialists up at Cornell University kept looking for better ways that they could create a growing media that would kind of substitute for that soil, so that it would be easier and more consistent and less expensive and less weight involved. And that really came pushing it. It was introduced in the 60s as what they call Cornell mix. And they had specific recipes that used these different ingredients. So a lot of them would be predominantly, or at least 50% or more, peat moss. That might be mixed with percentages of vermiculite and perlite, which is essentially inert material, but it's included in there to maintain aeration and good drainage. And then lime pretty much always has to be added because the peat moss is very acidic. And then because there's no actual mineral soil in there, fertilizer, the nutrients would have to be put into it. So they had these different blends. This was released, that little brochure that I found there was put out, published in 1966. And from that point on, it just really took off, that this is the way the industry was changing. So by the time we got, well into the 70s, and we were having, with energy crisis and fuel costs and stuff going, looking for ways to literally reduce weight and make shipping easier and all the efficiencies of production goes, pretty much the entire industry went over towards this type of a mix that's in there. And it's still widely used today, and it serves us really well. What's come up to here recently is concerns around the use of peat moss. Because when we're doing that, we're taking from these peat bogs. These are natural areas that exist mostly in northern climates, so we're talking up in, for us, Canada, up into Michigan, kind of area. Also, I think in, parts of northern, Russia, parts of large areas of Europe. But for years, for decades, and even centuries, peat has been harvested for different uses. But now what we're recognizing is that is a very valuable resource as a carbon sink, because it's basically all organic. That's where a lot of the carbon from the atmosphere is sequestered. And so as we are taking peat out of these areas, what are we doing as far as affecting our climate goes, disruption to habitat? And where I'm kind of going with this long-winded story is that a lot of this really came to hit home right about 2020. When right at the start of the pandemic, and many people at home, having time to garden and work in their yard, there's this huge explosion of demand, people looking for these products for their gardening projects. And at the same time, we had a couple years of really low peat harvest. The peat, interestingly enough, because again, these are very wet bogs, what they have to do is during dry spells, usually like midsummer in the dry season, the peat goes in. They've got equipment that essentially rakes the surface of it and then vacuums to pick it up. So there were a couple years that up in Canada, it was a wet summer and harvests were low, demand was high, plus all the environmental concerns that go with it. There was more and more effort towards looking at alternatives, things that don't contain peat. And I know you came to hear about plants, but this is what I've been working on for 2 years. And so I thought, you know, I like, it's got to be interesting for me. And this is what I've been really delving into for the last couple of years here at Merrifield, and wanted to share where we're going on some of this. So we've been experimenting with a lot of different mixes ourselves, as well as you see a lot of different mixes on the marketplace. We were just trying to bring soils in wherever we could find them. Also, you know, growing cannabis became a big thing, and so a lot more potting mixes came in, you know, oriented towards that use. You know, so you got natural, organic, and on and on and on. So what do we do if we say, hey, for all these different reasons, if I want to try to get away from using peat, we were looking at mixtures, and that would have, instead of peat, we're relying more on compost, aged bark, which is a common component in a lot of these different soils. Coir, I think is how we say it. I had to look that up myself, which is coconut fiber. Also, a lot of different wood fibers go in. So we're using some of these more renewable resources and blending them. Again, this is always say it's like cooking. Hey, we're mixing, we're matching, and we're trying these different things and putting there and testing on it. So I don't know what the answer is. And I'm not even pretending to say the answer. I think we have to kind of experiment and try. And a lot of this depends on what you're growing, what your habits are, the size of the pots, the containers. That's all this kind of thing going on. But interestingly enough, so what you're looking at right here is what I'm currently experimenting with. So my experience on the peat-free mix. Love the product in a lot of ways, but the material, it seems to drain quickly, required frequent watering, and some of these alternative products just don't have the same nutrient holding capacity. Peat does a really good job in a lot of ways. I mean, it has that right balance of being able to hold moisture but stay porous. Because of the acidity, it holds back a lot of pest problems. It's consistent in its texture and use. I mean, it just foots the bill in so many ways. We're having a little trouble getting away from it completely. So what I'm playing with right now, this is a blend that now has about 40% peat. It's also mixed with aged bark. And when I say wood fibers, we've been experimenting with that stuff forever. I remember trying a mix, this was a few years ago, it was just made out of recycled newspapers. But it was, I gotta just say, I mean, it was horrible. This stuff, again, wouldn't hold any moisture in it. Once it did get wet, it started getting moldy, and then it started stinking, you know, and they're just, you know, that stuff kind of went by the wayside. What we're playing with in here, this is kind of neat. You might see these tiny little thread-like structures. That's a material. It's called hydrofiber. It's wood cellulose. It's pine trees. Basically, as pine trees get chipped, essentially pressure cooked until it breaks down to just this fibrous material. But that's a managed on a renewable way. Let me also say that the peat industry has responded to trying to do some very responsible practices and restore and regenerate these areas when they're over. So anyway, my whole point of this is I'm not trying to recommend a product for you, but when you come into the store, whether it's here or any place you're shopping, you look at this stuff and it feels overwhelming. Don't overthink it. I keep saying, this is like cooking, where, hey, there might be 20 different recipes that can make a really good brownie or cookie, you know, and everybody's kind of trying their own recipe that's out there. And always talk to us, because depending on what you're growing, what conditions and so on, we might be able to make recommendations in there. But we're going through this. Like I said, this is what's under evaluation right now. I think you'll be we'll be coming out with new stuff. And when we do, when we feel like, hey, we found just the perfect mix out there, you'll see it. So one other thing, and then I will move on because I feel like I'm using all my time to talk about potting mix, but that's what I've been doing. So since we're talking about the potting mix, fungus gnats are a very common issue, and you can really find this in any of these products. The gnats lay their eggs in the soil, a little larvae develops. The larvae doesn't bite, it doesn't sting, it doesn't really harm the plants. But what they do is this little larvae is feeding on the organic content that's in the soil. It emerges out, and this is a tiny little gnat that you can see in that picture, and it buzzes around to annoy everybody. So I run into that problem a lot during the winter months. And if that's going on, there are a couple things you can do. One, if it's just you have a few plants and it's just not a big problem and it's just a nuisance level, these are sticky traps. There's no pesticides, no mixing, no measuring, no spreading, nothing like that you need to use. This is just this yellow color. It's a glue board. The gnats, I say, it's just like a moth to a flame. They see that bright yellow, they can't help themselves. They go flying, weakly buzz over there, and then they land on it. Boom, they get stuck on the glue trap. So that helps to prevent them from just buzzing around your face. If it's something that's getting to be more than that and becoming a problem issue, a lot of our customers had good success with this systemic insecticide. Super easy to use. It's a granule just based on the size of the pot. You kind of sprinkle some on the surface of the soil. It takes a while, but it's actually going down into the soil where it's killing the larvae that are in there. And a lot of people use these two together. Now, there's other options. One thing I want to say is you never want to use this. I do not want to use this on any kind of herbs that you might be growing in the house or citrus or any kind of edible plants, because again, this does get absorbed up into the plant itself. So this would be strictly for ornamentals. So with that, I've been talking enough. What I want to do is see if we have any questions or comments, and it doesn't matter whether it's on potting mix, but let's try to talk about anything with indoor gardening.
Sounds good. All right, David, I'm just going to go in order. So everybody, if you all have questions about anything houseplant related, please feel free to start sending those questions in, and we will get to as many as we can. All right, the first question for you is about begonias. This is from Fran. She says, I have a lot of experience with houseplants, but am unsuccessful with begonias. I can't seem to find the right balance of proper watering. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, so I'm assuming you're talking about like the Rex begonias and have the really gorgeous ornamental leaves. They can be a little challenging to grow indoors. Let me back up one step and say those that have like the shiny leaf on it, there's one they call, I think, a beefsteak plant, and sometimes the wax begonias. They're a little more forgiving, but the ones that have these really cool patterns on them and stuff, you know, like escargot is a real popular one that I love. They are fussy. You're trying to find that moist but well drained balance, so that can be a little bit tricky on there. And as you said, you know, when you water them, like most things, I do like to make sure you water thoroughly all the way through the pot, but let them get, you know, what I'm going to use this term, kind of half dry. Wait till it feels kind of like a moist or a wet sponge, of trying to maintain that level of moisture on there. I had trouble with them with also getting mildew for some reason when they're inside. And they do well under artificial lights or indirect light that's in there. So I'm probably just repeating all the stuff that you're already doing or knowing. If you have a chance, come in the store and I can talk to you about a couple soils that might be good for you to try. There's a brand new one. I have it here. So this is, and again, I try not to get hung up on any one particular product, but this one from Fertilome, we just started carrying it. It's a new product, so I don't have a lot of history with it, but I did look at samples of it, and we're kind of, what I say, playing around with it now. But it looks like it's got a good balance. It's a more traditional peat-based kind of mix. It doesn't have as much bark or wood in it. I think that would be a good one to use for the begonias.
Okay, excellent. All right, I actually have a question for you. We had one question. Can you repeat the name of the insect, the systemic insect control? It was just.
So again, we sell a couple different brands. This one, which I brought just because it's the small one, it's easier for me to carry and show. It's just called Systemic Houseplant Insect Control.
Okay. And do you know, I've heard of using vinegar and dish soap as a trap. Does that work for that? Or do you really need like the sticky traps or the systemic?
I think, I'm going to say, I think there might be some confusion about that because that is used sometimes as a trap for fungus gnat. I mean, for fruit flies.
Oh, okay.
Fruit flies are not the same thing as fungus gnats.
No, you're right. They're not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I live on a freshwater marsh, so we have a ton of bugs, and I'm having issues with plants, the fungus gnats specifically. Selfish question there. All right, next question. Although not strictly a houseplant question, this is a question about a plant in my house. I have an amaryllis with a flower stem about 12 inches, but the leaves are only up about 1 inch. It's been in the pot for over a month. Do you think it will bloom?
So hopefully you have a bud at the top of that. So I think it will bloom. I'm just, again, it's a little hard because we don't have the dialogue, but what should happen, and it sounds like it is, with amaryllis, first you get this huge stalk that comes up on there, big thick stalk, and hoping at the top of it is a big like Turk's cap shaped bud. And that bud will go up and just be patient, and that will open to a full bloom. The flowers, they're pretty amazing when they bloom, but they might last for a couple weeks, 3 weeks if you're really lucky. After that, at the end of the bloom cycle, and sometimes it was a big healthy bulb, you get a second or sometimes even a third spike up there. But at the end of his bloom cycle, then you cut those flower stalks off and the leaves come up and you just grow it as a foliage plant. So I think you are on track from what I'm hearing. I'm envisioning an amaryllis, like I said, the flowering stems coming up. It will open in its own good time, and I think you're close to it. Enjoy the flowers. And when that's done, then you're going to get these just big strap-like, long, skinny leaves. Keep it growing. And then, like I said, you can visit us or something. We can give you more details on how to get it to rebloom. But I think you're on a good path and it will flower.
Sounds good. All right, next question from Roseanne. How can I mix fireplace ash into planting or potting mix? I thought wood ashes were good for plants, but I'm not sure how you would use them in a garden or pot.
Yeah, so wood ash is a very good conditioner or a good, you call it a fertilizer, to use in soil. It has a kind of a line process. So, I mean, it's high in potassium and it's got lots of mineral contact. But what I'm trying to get to is it will raise your pH. If you do this over and over and over, or if you do it to excess, you can end up with higher elevated pHs. It's essentially an alternative to lime. So the real question on that is the application rates. It's a good amendment to use, but off the top of my head, I don't know the exact amendments, all I can, or amounts to use. So if I'm mixing it in with compost or into a container for use with potting mix, I can just say I would be kind of stingy on it. So if I'm looking at something like literally if I'm looking at something like this, a 6-inch pot, I'm probably thinking around a teaspoon, but that's kind of a guess.
Okay.
And I wouldn't do that over and over. I mean, that's something you might do, only when you're repotting, or like I said, if you're putting it out in your lawn or in your garden bed, vegetable garden, is like to use it. I wouldn't do it like even maybe once a year at most, and I'd probably feel more comfortable doing it like every couple of years. So spread it around. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Next question is from Jennifer. I'm trying to keep my summer mandevilla alive in plants inside, in pots inside, and they're hanging on by a thread. They're not thriving. How can I keep them happy? I thought misting them, but then they got a fungus and the leaves turned black and fall. So I'm now treating them for fungus.
Yeah, so that again, those plants are really challenging to get them to actually thrive through the winter. So a lot of times what we're doing, and I think you're going to get there, is just getting them to survive. Because this is a plant that wants to be, and full sun, and that's really hard to replicate in an indoor environment. So there's two different schools of thought on this. One is if you have a really like full sunroom kind of tropical environment, then in that kind of condition, you can keep them in there, keep them watered, fertilize them occasionally, keep them growing and productively moving along. Very, very few people have the right environment and are successful at it. So then plan B, which is what I'm kind of directing you to, is letting it literally go almost into a dormancy, and where you cut back because it's in lower light level, yellowing, shedding leaves, dropping leaves like you are, kind of cut way back on the watering, so that you don't let go completely fully dry, but allow it to dry out a little bit. You can even keep it in cooler conditions is better. And what you're doing is basically just trying to get it through the winter time. When spring arrives, and by the time we get to May and you can put it back outside, get it back out in the sunshine, the warmth, the sunshine, and oftentimes they will recover and come back. But trying to keep it looking good through the winter, very, very hard to do.
Okay. All right. Next question is from Facebook. Do you have any tips for help cyclamen thrive inside?
Yeah, so cyclamen is kind of like the opposite side of the mandevilla that I was talking about. Cyclamen love cool temperatures. Again, it's like, 50 to 70 degrees, 50 to 65 degrees. So they can be fussy on watering. If you overwater them, the corm rots. If you underwater them, the plants kind of wilt and droop. So what I like to do is kind of like you might do in African violet, where you water it from the bottom. I like to sort of let that water sort of soak up from the bottom. Don't ever allow it to go completely dry. And the real key for them is cool temperatures. So if you have a room that stays a little bit cooler and stuff that's in there, you can grow them. And I feel like I'm saying this a lot, but it's just my being realistic with you on the expectations. I've grown cyclamen and got them to rebloom, but it's hard to create the ideal conditions. When you come in and buy them from us, well, they've been grown at commercial greenhouses where they have climate control conditions. They can manage exactly what the temperature is with good lighting, and they can create these gorgeous plants. When we try to do that at home, we usually don't have the same amount of light available to us. We don't have control of the temperature, and we end up with plants that oftentimes a little bit leggy or more spindly than what we found when we bought them. But you can do it if you really want to. Generally, cyclamen, I look at that as a seasonal plant. I enjoy it. End of the season, put it in the compost and get a new one.
All right. Okay, next question. I have a Christmas cactus that never blooms. What do I need to do?
Yeah, so that's temperature. A lot of plants, and what I think I'll do is let me answer this question, and Sally, I'll show a couple of these plants I have in here.
Yeah, that'd be great.
But a lot of plants, there's different cues that they respond to in the environment. Some plants, it might be like in our climate, it might be winter, short days, cold temperatures induces a dormancy, and day length triggers the flowering on. On Christmas cactus, it's temperature. What it needs is warm days and cool nights. The nighttime temperature actually needs to be like 10 or 15 degrees cooler than it is during the daytime. So this is, again, back to saying commercial growers, hey, they're in a controlled environment. They can kind of set their temperature regimes and bring these things into bloom. If I'm going to say I have good success with these plants myself because I'm gone from home most of the time. I set my thermostat way down when I'm away. It's like I set it down to like 62 degrees. So my plants are sitting home in this 60-degree weather. And then when I spend more time at home, I turn it up. So I can induce flowering on these things. A lot of times the easiest way is in the fall of the year. It's too cold now. But if you have a covered porch, a screen porch where it's not full sun, it's going to scorch them. But let them spend some time outside where you get the warm day, cool night. But come up with a creative way. I'm sure you can. If you've got a room that's cooler in your house, set it in there for a month or two. And, keeping it watered and grow it, and then bring it back out into a warm part of your home, you'll probably get it to flower. But real quick, let me just show a couple of these pictures that came in, because I spent all this time talking about potting mix and discussing soil. So what I want to say, another way around this is to basically, not all plants grow in soil. So this is a collection what I call epiphytes. Epiphytes are plants that don't grow, that grow on a surface. So if you're in a jungle environment, actually, I think I took this picture, I believe years ago, down in your neighborhood, Sally, down Shelby Gardens, Florida. But I thought it was a nice demonstration when you have a tropical environment, plants growing, occupying, they're growing up and down on this tree trunk, you know, wherever there's a little coarse area where they can latch onto, these plants will just attach themselves to the trees, growing in lower canopies because you've got the sun, the moisture, and they just thrive. So these are plants that would frequently grow up in the canopy of trees and branch crotches and rock crevices and areas where they don't actually have soil to grow in. And these are just common examples of some of the more popular ones that are in there. So Tillandsia, which is one that I really did want to give a few minutes attention to today, frequently called air plants. So Tillandsia, what they do, they're in the bromeliad family, but a lot of them, they have along their leaves, you can't really see it, but their leaves, they have these scales and they actually absorb water through the leaves. So these plants don't need soil. Their root system is basically secondary. It will take some moisture up, but most of it is that they're just, those roots are anchoring or adhering them. And you can do all these creative things, like see this little one that's in the seashell. They do great in these terrarium kind of environments because they really need the high humidity. Put the little frog in here to keep attention. This is another way that you can display them. But they're just a fun, exciting group of plants. I always tell the same old story how my mother basically killed every plant I ever gave her. I had given her Tillandsia out of desperation, and she kept it alive for a year. That's a record for her. But this is just an idea. Like I said, that one is just mounted on a refrigerator magnet. This one of the ladies in our greenhouse put together. She mounted them onto a piece of bark and do a nice display. You saw the things there in my pictures. But the deal is, again, so it's just here, right? Living plant, living, growing, and they will flower for you. But because they're taking their moisture through the leaves, what we need to do is mist them as often as possible. I always kept a mist bottle right nearby. And so every time I saw my little Tillandsia there, I just give it a little spurt, squirt, mist leaves down. And then about, depending on how dry your environment is, it's terrarium or not, but it might be once every 2 weeks or so. I would literally take what I call a bath, where I would just take this plant, just drop it down into a little Tupperware container, let it get thoroughly moistened. But other than that, this is like the easiest thing in the world to grow. And we don't even necessarily have to grow it in soil. Now, like I mentioned, Spanish moss is also in this group, again, just dangling from the trees. Some of these plants, like bromeliads, in the same family, do grow in the soil. They can be epiphytes, like we talked about, or they can be terrestrial that grow in the soil, but it has to be well drained. So this is one, and you can see, I'm trying to do this where I don't make a mess, but these leaves, this rosette forms a little well or a vase, and water goes down into this little vase. I want to tip it over, then I'll make, because there's water in there, I forgot to drain it out. There are specialized cells down inside this vase, and they absorb water through that. So we need to always make sure that the little vase has water in there. That needs to be changed. I'm going to say I like to do it at least once a week, where we kind of either dump or flush out the old water, put some fresh water in there, just to keep it clean. This is sending up a flower spike now that's in here. This bloom spike will last for a long, long time. And after a few months, literally, it might look nice. It will fade. And usually the mother plant begins to die, but it will produce little pups, little side shoots that come off of here. So this is a plant that's kind of fun to grow, very easy to grow because it doesn't need that much attention to watering. It does do well in kind of bright but indirect light. And one super quick thing, because I see I'm going to waste my time here, is I want to say a thing or two about orchids, because many of the orchids are also epiphytes. You see this, these are aerial roots. So again, they're just covered with this vellum. In areas that get a lot of frequent, sometimes daily rains, the moisture just goes straight through this into the root. So it doesn't have all the root hairs. It's not adapted to growing down actually in the ground. So again, we will grow this, and I like to use, depending on the type of orchid, this is again sphagnum moss, long fiber sphagnum peat moss that we talked about in here, has those great sponge-like properties. Other growers and other types of orchids do better just growing in essentially a bark mix. But orchids, and that's why I wanted to say it, they also, like the Christmas cactus, really need that warm day, cool night to initiate the flowering on. So let's go back to, I see I only have a few minutes, but maybe we can get another question or two if I don't talk so much.
Yeah, we'll go through a few more questions. And I just want to remind everybody, if we don't get to your question today, you guys can send me an email, and I'll go ahead and put my email out in the chat before we close, just so that people can follow up if they want to. I forward the questions today, but I do not answer them myself. So you will still get expert advice. All right, next question. What are your thoughts on how often do you fertilize orchids? Do you have any advice for encouraging blooms?
Yeah, so I kind of follow, there's one strategy, one cool says fertilize weekly. So what's worked well for me is I just use a very weak fertilizer mix, but I do it on a frequent basis. So if I have, again, this all depends on your environment, a lot of conditions, but an orchid like this, Phalaenopsis orchid, I want this thing to get almost like what I call scary dry. Like I've got where I walk by and suddenly it topples over because it was so dry it's in there. The number one problem we have with orchids is people overwatering it. So I make sure that it gets pretty dry. And then at that point, then I flood it. I mean, really flood it. I like at that time, I do like to put just a few drops of liquid fertilizer, and there's many to choose from. So this is what sphagnum moss looks like. I want to show that to you that I grow. This isn't really nice. These are orchid pots I brought in. So ones I like is transparent, so I can actually see what's going on with the roots if I'm having any issues regarding too wet and root rot in there. They have exceptionally good drainage in here, holes along the sides, even has an aeration hole that goes in here. So back to your question about how you get in bloom. Number one is just really is managing the water. The fertilizer, I just like to use like Jack's has an orchid fertilizer. I like the water soluble ones. Just put a few tiny little drops, in there. Do that basically every time I water them. And then, like I said, to initiate flowering, which is the real trick, is you need a place where they're going to have cool temperatures. Put them in a cool room. Just even if you can put them in there for a few weeks and then bring them back into the warmth, you'll see them flower.
Okay. All right. We'll take a couple more questions and then we'll have to bring it to an end. But now, can you address some of the choices for artificial lighting, like the LED lighting, full spectrum? Do you have any recommendations for people who want to use that?
I would, I just have to say, I would really go with LED. I think that's the way to go. The reason I'm hesitating is because we have had a very difficult time getting LED lights in stock. Still one of those little supply chain glitches. So that's the only reason I'm hesitating, because I don't have a good selection to offer you at the garden center right now. But LED offers so many advantages in terms of efficiencies, brightness, offering the full spectrum that's in there. I don't have a particular brand to show you. What we have mostly right now is compact fluorescent, which again is great for energy efficiency, and if you're doing science projects or you just have a house plant here or there, those do really well. But I would be shopping for LED lighting right now, full spectrum.
Okay. All right. I'm going to do one more question, and then I'm just going to remind everybody, please feel free to follow up by email. We've got more and more questions come in, which is great, but you can call the store. You can come into the plant clinic as well to talk to David or another member of the plant clinic. And this is great. We have so many questions, but I am sorry we won't be able to get to all of them. All right. Here's the question, David. I have had real problems with houseplants recently, and I'm wondering how much proximity to a heat vent can be tolerated. If not, how far from the vent source should you place your plants? I know that's probably relevant to a lot of people.
Yeah, and that's a big issue. I think that's a bigger issue than we really recognize, because again, you think about these plants that are growing in tropical environments where humidity levels of 70, 80, 100% is commonplace. And right now in the wintertime, and we're having some dry weather, you could easily have humidity levels in your home that are, down to 20% or even lower. And if a heat vent is directed on there, that's just really complicating stuff that's in there. I would prefer if there's like no air blowing directly on it, so where you don't feel any air directed on there. There's a few things that you can do to increase the humidity. One is if you group plants together, kind of like we have here, they somewhat, in a small way, help humidify each other. I didn't bring it in here with me, but I'm a big fan of humidity trays. So essentially there would be a saucer under here. This is elevated on there, maybe on a bed of pebbles. And so then moisture from here can keep coming up and helping to keep a better humidity in that region. I'm also a fan of misting plants. I think whenever you feel like if you're going by and you just want to show them a little love, spritz a little water on them, and that boosts the humidity on a temporary sort of way. So maybe even if you can get one of those deflectors on from your heat vent to keep it away, but that's gonna put a stress on them, definitely.
Yeah, I know winter's hard on houseplants because they like, a lot of them like humidity.
I got some customers that go out and get a humidifier for their plant. That's a little more commitment than I'm willing to make.
I have a humidifier for myself, but I would put it on my plants if I felt that it would help them. Thankfully, as many of you all know, I'm down in Florida, so I have no issues with humidity. All right, David, it is 2:48. I am sorry, everybody, that we cannot stay and take all of these questions. There are some really good ones about all kinds of different plants. I do want to note, we just had Nancy. Thank you, Nancy. She just commented about the houseplant lighting and said that the Smithsonian Let's Talk Gardens had a presentation today on houseplant lighting. So that should be available later today, which is nice, on their website. For anybody who wants to follow up on their questions, like I said, you can contact by phone any of the plant clinics. You can come in to visit us in the store. You can send me an email. I'll share it with David. And we will get you guys the answers that you have about all of your plants. So David, do you want to wrap up with anything else before we close?
Yeah, I really appreciate that tip for the Smithsonian. There's so many good resources out there, and I love encouraging people to take advantage of all that. The other is, so next time, a couple of weeks from now, we're going to switch gears. I want to talk about going outside and talk about pruning on deciduous trees and shrubs. So hope you'll join us for that, and see you then.
Thank you. Yes. And one more announcement, because we had a lot of people asking questions that I saw. We have a class, the Bonsai Society is coming back. Now that we're in person, we will have a class on bonsai this season. We are also having a class on citrus this season. So go check our website out. If you guys are asking about bonsai and citrus, we have some classes specifically devoted to those topics coming up.
And African violets and orchids.
Oh, and African violets and orchids.
Keep going, right?
Honestly, all of our instructors, everybody, you know this, David, they're so excited to get back to in person. We love Zoom too, but people like seeing all of you all. So we have a lot of classes coming up, which is great. All righty, David, thank you so much. Everybody, thank you for joining us. Happy New Year. Have a great afternoon.